Sometimes a single moment of disrespect can shake the very foundations of power. Sometimes those who think they hold all the cards discover that honor runs deeper than rank, and that some debts can never be forgotten. What happens when three young soldiers decide to humiliate an old man they see as weak and worthless, only to discover that this forgotten figure once commanded the respect of the highest military officials in the nation? What happens when their cruel laughter echoes through the wrong ears, and their moment of perceived triumph becomes the catalyst for consequences they never saw coming? This is the story of how one act of cruelty against a decorated war veteran triggered a chain of events that would lock down an entire military base, involve three generals, and teach a lesson about respect that would echo through the ranks for years to come. It's a story about the invisible threads that connect past and present, about the weight of service that never truly ends, and about how sometimes justice comes not from the law, but from those who understand the true meaning of honor. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Henderson as 73-year-old Samuel Martinez slowly made his way toward the base commissary. His weathered hands gripped a worn wooden cane, each step deliberate and measured. The arthritis in his left knee, a souvenir from his time in Vietnam, flared with each movement, but Samuel had learned long ago to push through pain that would cripple younger men. His appearance drew little attention from the bustling soldiers around him. To them, he was just another retiree taking advantage of base privileges, perhaps a former clerk or supply sergeant enjoying the benefits he had earned through 20 years of mundane service. His simple khaki pants and plain white polo shirt gave no hint of his distinguished past. The only indication of his military background was a small American flag pin on his collar and the way he carried himself despite his obvious physical limitations. Samuel had deliberately chosen to blend in during these weekly shopping trips. After retiring 15 years ago, he had grown tired of the salutes, the sudden straightening of spines, and the wide-eyed recognition that came when people learned who he really was. He preferred anonymity now, finding peace in being treated as just another old-timer rather than the legend he had once been. As he approached the commissary entrance, three young soldiers emerged from the building, their arms loaded with energy drinks and snacks. Private First Class Jake Morrison, a 21-year-old from Texas, led the group with the swagger of someone who believed his recent promotion made him invincible. Behind him walked Specialist Marcus Chen, whose technical skills had earned him respect among his peers but had also inflated his ego beyond his actual rank. The third member of their group, Private Tommy Rodriguez, was the youngest at 19. Eager to fit in with the older soldiers and prove his worth through increasingly reckless behavior. The three had spent the morning complaining about their weekend duty assignments, their frustration building as they watched other soldiers head off base for liberty. Their conversation had centered around their mutual belief that they deserved better treatment, that their superiors failed to recognize their potential, and that the military was filled with outdated traditions that held back truly talented individuals like themselves. As Samuel slowly climbed the 3 concrete steps leading to the commissary entrance, his cane slipped slightly on the smooth surface. He paused for a moment, steadying himself with his free hand against the metal railing, taking a careful breath before continuing his ascent. The momentary pause was all the excuse the 3 soldiers needed to voice their impatience. "Come on, old man. We don't have all day," Jake called out, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that comes from believing oneself superior to others. "Maybe you should have stayed home instead of holding up everyone else." Samuel glanced up at the young soldier, his dark eyes taking in the pressed uniform and freshly shaved face. He said nothing, simply nodding slightly and continuing his careful progress up the steps. His silence only seemed to embolden Jake, who turned to his companions with a smirk. "Look at this guy," Jake continued, his voice growing louder. "Probably some desk jockey who spent his whole career pushing papers. Now he thinks he's entitled to take up everyone's time because he's got a few aches and pains." Marcus Chen laughed, adding his own commentary. "These old-timers always think they deserve special treatment." Bet he never saw a day of real action in his life, probably spent Vietnam in some air-conditioned office while real soldiers were doing the fighting. The words hit Samuel like physical blows, not because they hurt his feelings, but because they revealed something deeply troubling about these young men, who wore the same uniform he had worn with such pride. He paused again, this time not from physical necessity, but from the weight of what he was hearing. Tommy Rodriguez, desperate to prove himself to his older companions, decided to escalate the situation. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. "You hear us talking to you? Maybe you should move a little faster, or better yet, maybe you should shop online like other people your age." Samuel finally reached the top of the steps and turned slightly to face the 3 soldiers. His weathered face remained calm, but there was something in his dark eyes that should have warned the young men to reconsider their approach. Instead,
They interpreted his silence as weakness, his restraint as fear. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" Jake taunted, stepping closer to Samuel. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too senile to understand what's happening around you?" The small crowd of shoppers that had gathered to witness the confrontation began to murmur among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were seeing, but none stepped forward to intervene. The three young soldiers were clearly active duty, their ranks visible on their uniforms, while Samuel appeared to be just another elderly retiree. In the complex hierarchy of military life, it seemed clear who held the power in this situation. Samuel slowly shifted his weight, transferring his cane to his left hand and using his right to reach into his back pocket. The movement was careful and deliberate, but Jake misinterpreted it as either a threat or an attempt to retrieve identification to prove his military credentials. "Oh, now you want to show us your papers?" Jake laughed harshly. "Let me guess. You were some kind of war hero, right? That's what all you old guys claim. Well, let me tell you something, Grandpa. Times have changed. The military doesn't need has-beens who can barely walk up 3 steps. What happened next would be recounted in military circles for years to come, though the exact details would vary depending on who told the story. What remained consistent in every version was that Samuel Martinez, rather than producing identification or engaging in an argument with the 3 soldiers, simply smiled. It was a small, sad smile that seemed to carry the weight of decades of experience and disappointment. "You boys have a good day," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the slight accent of his New Mexican childhood. "And thank you for your service." The unexpected response caught the 3 soldiers off guard. They had been prepared for anger, for indignation, perhaps for an elderly man trying to assert his authority or prove his worth. Instead, they were faced with genuine courtesy from someone they had just publicly humiliated. Jake's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. The calm response from Samuel made him feel foolish, and his embarrassment quickly transformed into rage. "Don't patronize us, old man," he snarled. "We don't need thanks from someone like you." It was then that Tommy Rodriguez made the decision that would change everything. Whether driven by peer pressure, genuine malice, or simply the poor judgment that comes with youth and arrogance, he stepped forward and gave Samuel a hard shove with both hands. The push wasn't violent enough to seriously injure the elderly man, but it was forceful enough to send him stumbling backward. Samuel's cane clattered across the concrete as he struggled to maintain his balance, his arms windmilling as he fought against gravity and his own physical limitations. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, it appeared that Samuel might fall down the concrete steps behind him. The gathered crowd gasped, several people stepping forward to help. But Samuel managed to catch himself against the metal railing, his breathing heavy as he steadied himself. The commissary entrance fell completely silent. Even Jake and Marcus seemed stunned by their companion's actions, recognizing that pushing an elderly man crossed a line that their previous verbal taunts had not. Tommy himself looked shocked by his own behavior, his face pale as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Samuel slowly straightened himself, retrieving his cane with careful movements. His hands shook slightly, though whether from the physical shock of nearly falling or from suppressed emotion was impossible to determine. When he looked up at the 3 soldiers, his expression had changed. The patient tolerance was gone, replaced by something harder to define but unmistakably serious. "I'm going to forget this happened," Samuel said quietly, his voice steady despite his obvious physical distress. "But I suggest you boys take some time to think about what it means to wear that uniform." With that, he turned and walked into the commissary, leaving the 3 soldiers standing in uncomfortable silence. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads in disgust, others whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. Jake, Marcus, and Tommy exchanged uncertain glances. The adrenaline that had fueled their confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. They had expected their encounter with the old man to be a source of entertainment, something to laugh about later. Instead, they found themselves feeling strangely hollow, as if they had lost something important without realizing what it was. Unknown to the 3 soldiers, their actions had been witnessed by more than just civilian shoppers and off-duty personnel. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had been observing from her vehicle in the parking lot, had seen the entire incident. As a 15-year veteran and member of the base military police, she recognized behavior that violated both military regulations and basic human decency. More importantly, Gonzalez had recognized Samuel Martinez, though she doubted the 3 young soldiers had any idea who they had just assaulted. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her radio, knowing that what she was about to report would send shockwaves through the entire command structure. As Samuel disappeared into the commissary, continuing with his weekly shopping as if nothing had happened,
The three soldiers walked toward their barracks, unaware that their lives were about to change dramatically. They joked nervously among themselves, trying to recapture the bravado they had felt earlier, but the laughter sounded forced and hollow.
None of them noticed Staff Sergeant Gonzalez following at a discreet distance, speaking quietly into her radio. None of them saw the black sedan that pulled up to the base headquarters building 15 minutes later, or the grim-faced colonel who emerged and strode quickly toward the command center. They had no way of knowing that within the hour 3 generals would be contacted, that emergency meetings would be called, and that their names would be at the center of conversations taking place in offices they had never seen, spoken by officers whose rank they could barely comprehend. As Samuel Martinez carefully selected his groceries, moving slowly through the aisles with the patience that comes from having nowhere urgent to be, the 3 soldiers who had humiliated him continued their day in blissful ignorance of the storm that was gathering around them. The old man they had dismissed as irrelevant, the veteran they had assumed was just another desk-bound retiree, had served his country in ways they couldn't imagine. And though he had chosen to handle their disrespect with dignity and restraint, others who knew his true story would not be so forgiving. The afternoon sun was beginning to shift toward evening as Samuel completed his shopping and made his way back to his modest apartment off base. Behind him at Fort Henderson, phones were ringing in offices throughout the command structure, and the names Jake Morrison, Marcus Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez were being written on documents that would soon reach the highest levels of military authority. The 3 soldiers had no way of knowing that they had just made the biggest mistake of their military careers, and possibly their lives. Colonel James Patterson was reviewing routine paperwork in his office when his secure phone rang with the particular tone that indicated an urgent communication from his superiors. After 25 years of military service, Patterson had learned to distinguish between routine calls and those that would fundamentally alter his day. This was clearly the latter.
"Colonel Patterson," he answered, setting down his pen and giving the call his full attention. "Colonel, this is General Morrison's office," came the crisp voice of the general's aide.
"The general needs to see you immediately. Priority 1. Patterson felt his stomach tighten.
Priority 1 meetings were reserved for situations involving national security, major incidents, or circumstances that could potentially embarrass the military at the highest levels. As the commanding officer of Fort Henderson, he ran through recent events in his mind, trying to identify what could have triggered such urgent attention from division headquarters.
"I'll be there in 20 minutes, Patterson replied, already reaching for his dress uniform jacket. "Sir, the general is flying in. He'll be at your headquarters in 30 minutes. Please have your senior staff available."
The line went dead, leaving Patterson staring at the phone with growing dread. Generals didn't fly to base headquarters for minor issues.
Whatever had happened was serious enough to pull a 3-star general away from his regular duties and send him directly to Fort Henderson. Patterson's aide, Major Susan Williams, knocked on his door within minutes of the phone call ending. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of concern that matched his own growing anxiety. "Sir, I've been getting calls from division headquarters for the past hour," Williams reported. "They're requesting personnel files for 3 soldiers, Private First Class Morrison, Specialist Chen, and Private Rodriguez. They've also requested a complete incident report from Staff Sergeant Gonzalez."
Patterson's mind raced through the implications. 3 soldiers significant enough to trigger general-level attention, plus an incident report that had somehow reached the highest echelons of command within hours of occurrence.
"This wasn't a routine disciplinary matter. Get me those files immediately," Patterson ordered, "and find Staff Sergeant Gonzalez. I want to know exactly what happened before General Morrison arrives." As Major Williams hurried from his office, Patterson walked to his window overlooking the main parade ground. Fort Henderson was going about its normal late-afternoon routine. Soldiers were conducting physical training, vehicles moved between buildings, and the steady rhythm of military life continued unchanged. Within the hour, he knew that normalcy would be shattered. 20 minutes later, Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez stood at attention in Patterson's office, a report lying open on his desk. As she recounted the incident at the commissary, Patterson felt his worst fears being confirmed. The situation wasn't just serious, it was potentially catastrophic. "Sergeant Gonzalez," Patterson said carefully, "are you absolutely certain of the identification you made?" "There can be no margin for error in this matter." Gonzalez maintained her rigid posture, her voice steady and professional. "Sir, I am completely certain. I've studied Colonel Martinez's photograph and service record extensively as part of my military history coursework. Additionally, I've seen him at base functions over the past several years. There is no doubt in my mind regarding his identity." Patterson nodded grimly. He had hoped against hope that Gonzalez had been mistaken, that the elderly man assaulted by 3 soldiers under his command was simply another retiree rather than one of the most decorated veterans in modern military history. Colonel Samuel Martinez, retired, was a legend within military circles, though he had spent the past 15 years deliberately avoiding public attention. His service record read like a compilation of every significant military action from the past 50 years: Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. 5 Bronze Stars, 3 Silver Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Cross. More importantly for the current situation, Martinez had served as personal military advisor to 3 presidents and had been instrumental in developing counterinsurgency tactics that were still taught at military academies worldwide. But his most significant characteristic, from Patterson's current perspective, was his personal relationships with the current military leadership. General Morrison, who was flying to Fort Henderson, had served under Martinez as a young lieutenant in Iraq. General Harrison, the Army Chief of Staff, had been Martinez's executive officer during the Bosnia deployment. General Thompson, who oversaw all personnel matters, had been personally mentored by Martinez during his rise through the ranks. These weren't just professional relationships between colleagues of different generations. These men viewed Samuel Martinez as a father figure, a mentor whose guidance had shaped their careers and their understanding of military service. The fact that 3 soldiers under Patterson's command had physically assaulted this particular veteran was a crisis of unimaginable proportions. Patterson's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of his command sergeant major, Robert Jackson, whose grave expression indicated that word of the situation was already spreading through the senior enlisted ranks. "Colonel," Jackson said without preamble, "I've had the 3 soldiers confined to quarters pending your orders. I've also initiated a complete investigation into their recent conduct and performance. Initial reports suggest this incident may not be an isolated example of poor judgment." The news grew worse with each passing minute. Patterson reviewed the personnel files that Major Williams had provided, discovering patterns of behavior that should have triggered closer supervision long before today's incident. Jake Morrison had received multiple counseling sessions for disrespectful conduct towards senior personnel. Marcus Chen had been written up for making disparaging comments about veteran retirees during a base function. Tommy Rodriguez had been involved in an altercation with a disabled veteran at the base gym just 2 weeks prior. The pattern painted a picture of 3 soldiers whose attitudes toward military tradition and respect for veterans had been deteriorating for months, if not longer. Their actions at the commissary weren't an aberration. They were the predictable culmination of a pattern of behavior that had been inadequately addressed by their immediate supervisors. Patterson was still reviewing the files when the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors announced General Morrison's arrival. Through his window, he watched the VH-60 Whitehawk settle onto the landing pad, its rotor wash sending dust swirling across the parade ground. The general emerged from the aircraft before the rotors had fully stopped, his stride purposeful and his expression thunderous. General Morrison was followed by his aide and 2 other officers whose presence indicated the scope of attention this incident had already generated. Patterson recognized Colonel Williams from the Inspector General's office and Lieutenant Colonel Harris from the Office of Military Justice. This wasn't just a disciplinary matter. It was being treated as a full-scale crisis, requiring immediate and comprehensive response. Patterson met the general at the headquarters entrance, snapping to attention as Morrison approached. The general's first words confirmed Patterson's worst fears about the gravity of the situation. "Colonel Patterson, I want you to understand that what happened on your base today has reached the highest levels of military command," Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The Secretary of Defense has been briefed. The Joint Chiefs have been informed. This incident involves one of the most respected veterans in modern military history, and the response will be swift and comprehensive." As they walked toward Patterson's office, Morrison continued his explanation. "Colonel Martinez called me personally to inform me of what happened. Not to complain, not to demand action, but to ensure that I was aware of potential disciplinary issues within my former command structure. Even after being physically assaulted by soldiers under your command, his primary concern was for the welfare of the military and the need to address conduct that reflects poorly on the uniform." The statement hit Patterson like a physical blow. The idea that Samuel Martinez had called to express concern for the military, rather than to seek retribution for his own mistreatment, demonstrated exactly why this man commanded such respect from the highest levels of military leadership. In Patterson's office, General Morrison took a seat and gestured for the other officers to remain standing. The informal seating arrangement was more ominous than a formal military briefing would have been, indicating that this was a personal matter for the general rather than a routine military procedure. Colonel Martinez served as my commanding officer during some of the most difficult operations in Iraq. Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of personal history. He saved my career, and probably my life, on more occasions than I can count. More importantly, he shaped my understanding of what it means to be a leader, what it means to serve with honor, and what it means to respect the sacrifices that others have made for this country. Morrison paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. The 3 soldiers who assaulted him today represent everything that is wrong with the current generation of military personnel. They embody the entitled, disrespectful attitude that threatens to undermine the very foundations of military discipline and honor. Patterson felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning in his office. He had commanded Fort Henderson for 2 years, without any incidents that reached beyond his immediate chain of command. Now, in the span of a single afternoon, he was dealing with a crisis that had reached the Secretary of Defense and involved personal relationships between current military leadership and the victim of assault by his soldiers. "Sir," Patterson said carefully, "I take full responsibility for this incident. The soldiers involved were under my command, and their conduct reflects failures in leadership and oversight that ultimately trace back to my office." Morrison nodded grimly. "That's correct, Colonel. And while I appreciate your willingness to accept responsibility, the primary focus right now is on ensuring that justice is served and that this kind of incident never happens again." Lieutenant Colonel Harris stepped forward with a thick folder of documents. "Colonel Patterson, we're implementing immediate measures that have been coordinated between General Morrison, General Harrison, and General Thompson. First, Fort Henderson is being placed under complete lockdown effective immediately. No personnel will be allowed to leave the base until this investigation is complete." The announcement sent a chill through Patterson's spine. Base lockdowns were extraordinary measures typically reserved for security breaches or incidents involving potential threats to national security. Implementing such a measure in response to an assault on a retiree indicated the unprecedented seriousness with which this incident was being treated. Harris continued reading from his documents. "Second, all personnel on duty today will be interviewed by military investigators. Third, the 3 soldiers involved will be held in military custody pending formal charges. Fourth, there will be a complete review of disciplinary procedures and leadership oversight at Fort Henderson." Colonel Williams from the Inspector General's office added his own requirements. "Additionally, we'll be conducting a comprehensive audit of similar incidents involving disrespectful conduct toward veterans or retirees. Any patterns of behavior that mirror today's incident will result in immediate administrative or judicial action." The scope of the response was beginning to overwhelm Patterson. What had started as an incident involving 3 soldiers was expanding into a base-wide investigation that could affect hundreds of personnel and potentially end multiple careers, including his own. General Morrison stood, indicating that the initial briefing was concluding. "Colonel Patterson, I want you to understand that this response isn't just about punishing the soldiers involved in today's incident. It's about sending a message throughout the military that disrespect toward veterans, particularly veterans of Colonel Martinez's stature, will not be tolerated under any circumstances." As the general prepared to leave for his inspection of the base, he delivered one final piece of information that completed Patterson's understanding of the crisis he was facing. "Colonel Martinez has requested that no special consideration be given to his case, that it be handled according to standard military justice procedures," Morrison said. However, Generals Harrison and Thompson have made it clear that there will be nothing standard about the response to this incident. The 3 soldiers involved have not just assaulted a retiree, they have disrespected the service and sacrifice of one of the most distinguished veterans in modern military history. With that, General Morrison left Patterson's office, beginning an inspection tour that would take him to every corner of Fort Henderson. Behind him, he left the command structure in crisis, senior officers scrambling to understand the full implications of the morning's events, and 3 young soldiers who had no idea that their moment of casual cruelty had triggered a response that would reshape their lives forever. As the late afternoon sun cast longer shadows across Fort Henderson, the base that had operated normally just hours earlier was now locked down tight, its personnel confined while military investigators began arriving to conduct one of the most comprehensive investigations in the base's history. The storm that Samuel Martinez had chosen not to unleash through his own actions was now being unleashed by others who understood the true magnitude of what had occurred on the commissary steps that morning. The military police arrived at the barracks housing Jake Morrison, Marcus Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez at exactly 1700 hours, their timing coordinated to ensure simultaneous arrests that would prevent any communication between the 3 soldiers. The precision of the operation reflected the serious nature of the charges they were about to face. Jake Morrison was in his room playing video games when two MPs knocked on his door, their expressions stern and professional. After the incident at the commissary, he had spent the afternoon trying to convince himself that nothing would come of their confrontation with the old man. Elderly veterans complained about military personnel all the time, he reasoned, and rarely were their grievances taken seriously by command structures focused on more pressing concerns. Private First Class Morrison, announced Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres, the lead MP. You are under arrest for assault on a military retiree, conduct unbecoming a soldier and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 134. You have the right to remain silent, and the right to legal representation. The words hit Jake like cold water. He had expected perhaps a counseling session, maybe extra duty or a formal reprimand. The possibility of arrest had never entered his mind. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he finally began to understand that the morning's events had consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. Across the base, Marcus Chen was experiencing his own moment of reckoning. He had been in the base library, studying for a promotion exam, when military police surrounded his table. The other soldiers in the library stopped what they were doing to watch as Chen was informed of his rights and led away in handcuffs, their whispered conversations adding to the atmosphere of shock and speculation that was beginning to permeate the entire base.
Tommy Rodriguez, the youngest of the three and the one whose physical push had escalated the situation beyond verbal harassment, was found in the base gym attempting to work off his growing anxiety with an intense workout. The MPs who arrested him noted his pale complexion and shaking hands, signs that he was beginning to grasp the severity of his actions.
As the three soldiers were transported to the base detention facility, word of their arrest spread rapidly through Fort Henderson's close-knit community. The base lockdown had already created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty, but the sight of three soldiers being arrested in coordinated operations elevated the situation to a new level of seriousness. In his modest apartment 15 miles from the base, Samuel Martinez was preparing a simple dinner when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized immediately, and his heart grew heavy as he realized what the call would likely entail. "Sam," came the familiar voice of General Morrison. "I wanted to call you personally to let you know that we've arrested the three soldiers involved in this morning's incident. I also wanted to apologize both personally and on behalf of the United States Army for what you experienced today." Samuel set down his coffee cup and walked to his living room window, looking out at the peaceful suburban neighborhood where he had chosen to spend his retirement years. "Robert, you know that's not necessary," he said quietly. "Those boys made a mistake, but I don't want their lives destroyed over it." "Sam, with all due respect, this goes far beyond a simple mistake," Morrison replied. "What happened today represents a fundamental failure in military discipline and respect for service. These soldiers physically assaulted a decorated veteran, and their actions reflect attitudes that have no place in today's military." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Samuel repeatedly trying to minimize the incident while Morrison explained the broader implications for military discipline and the precedent that needed to be established. By the call's end, it was clear that regardless of Samuel's personal wishes, the military justice system would follow its course with unprecedented thoroughness. After hanging up, Samuel walked to his study and opened a large wooden cabinet that contained his military memorabilia. Photographs from 5 decades of service lined the shelves, images of him with fellow soldiers in Vietnam, receiving commendations from various presidents, leading troops in desert operations, and working alongside officers who had gone on to become the current generation of military leaders. One photograph in particular drew his attention. It showed a much younger Robert Morrison receiving a Bronze Star for valor during a particularly difficult operation in Iraq. Samuel remembered the citation ceremony clearly, not just because he had recommended Morrison for the decoration, but because of the conversation they had shared afterward about leadership, respect, and the responsibilities that came with wearing the uniform. That conversation, like many others over the years, had focused on the idea that military service was not just a job but a calling that required constant attention to honor, dignity, and respect for those who had served before. The irony was not lost on Samuel that Morrison was now in a position where he had to demonstrate those same principles in response to an assault on his former commanding officer. Meanwhile, at Fort Henderson, the investigation was expanding far beyond the initial incident. Military investigators had arrived from 3 different commands, their presence turning the base into what felt like a crime scene rather than a functioning military installation. Major Williams had been assigned as the primary investigating officer, a role that required her to coordinate between multiple agencies while ensuring that proper procedures were followed. Her first priority was conducting comprehensive interviews with everyone who had witnessed the commissary incident, but she quickly discovered that the scope of investigation was expanding to include months of prior behavior by the 3 arrested soldiers. Colonel Patterson, Williams reported during an evening briefing. The preliminary interviews are revealing a pattern of conduct that goes far beyond today's incident. We've identified at least 6 other instances over the past 4 months where these soldiers displayed disrespectful behavior toward military retirees or veterans. Patterson felt his career prospects dimming with each new revelation. The pattern Williams described suggested not just individual failures by 3 soldiers, but systematic failures in leadership oversight that had allowed such attitudes to develop and persist under his command. Furthermore, Williams continued, we're discovering that complaints about their behavior were filed with their immediate supervisors but were not forwarded up the chain of command. This suggests either incompetence or deliberate cover-up at the company level. The investigation was meticulously thorough. Every witness was interviewed multiple times, security camera footage from around the commissary was analyzed frame by frame, and the complete service records of all involved personnel were subjected to detailed scrutiny. Military investigators were treating the case with the same seriousness typically reserved for matters involving national security or major military crimes. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the military defense attorney assigned to represent the 3 soldiers, found herself facing an unprecedented challenge. Her clients had not just committed assault. They had assaulted a figure whose personal relationships with current military leadership made any meaningful defense extremely difficult. During her first meeting with Jake Morrison, Walsh attempted to explain the gravity of his situation. Private Morrison, you need to understand that the person you and your friends assaulted is not just any retiree. Colonel Martinez is personally known by every general in your chain of command. His service record is legendary within military circles, and his influence on current military leadership cannot be overstated. Jake's response revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about what had occurred.
But ma'am, he was just some old guy. We didn't know who he was.
How were we supposed to know he was important? Walsh struggled to explain concepts that should have been fundamental to any soldier's understanding of military service. Private, the issue isn't whether you knew his specific identity.
The issue is that you physically assaulted an elderly veteran, period. In the military, we respect all veterans regardless of their rank or service record, because they have earned that respect through their service to the country. Similar conversations with Marcus Chen and Tommy Rodriguez revealed the same fundamental disconnect between their understanding of military values and the reality of what military service actually required. Their attitudes reflected not just personal character flaws but educational failures that suggested broader problems with military training and leadership development.
As news of the incident and subsequent arrests spread beyond Fort Henderson, media attention began to focus on the story. Military affairs reporters, always alert to stories involving veteran affairs and military discipline, recognized the significance of the incident and the unprecedented nature of the military response. The first news reports appeared on military news websites within 24 hours of the arrests, describing the incident in terms that emphasized both the assault on the veteran and the military's swift response. The stories quickly gained traction on social media, where veteran organizations and military families expressed outrage at the treatment of the elderly veteran and praise for the military leadership's decisive action. Samuel Martinez, who had spent 15 years successfully avoiding media attention, suddenly found reporters calling his phone and appearing at his apartment complex. His neighbors, most of whom knew him simply as a quiet retiree who kept to himself, were shocked to learn about his distinguished military background and the incident that had thrust him into national attention. The media coverage added another layer of pressure to an already intense situation. Fort Henderson's public affairs office found itself fielding dozens of calls from reporters seeking information about the investigation, the arrested soldiers, and the military's response to veteran-related incidents. Colonel Patterson realized that his handling of the situation was being watched not just by his military superiors, but by the national media and veteran organizations across the country. Any mistakes in procedure, any appearance of inadequate response, would be scrutinized by audiences far beyond the military community. On the second day after the arrests, a development occurred that elevated the situation to an even higher level of significance. General Harrison, the Army Chief of Staff, announced that he would be visiting Fort Henderson personally to review the investigation and assess the base's leadership and disciplinary procedures. The announcement sent shockwaves through the base's command structure. Visits by the Army Chief of Staff were extraordinarily rare events, typically occurring only during major ceremonies, critical inspections, or crisis situations of national importance.
Harrison's decision to visit Fort Henderson personally indicated that the incident was being treated at the highest levels of military leadership as a defining moment for military discipline and veteran respect. Preparations for General Harrison's visit consumed the entire base staff. Every aspect of Fort Henderson's operations would be subject to scrutiny by the Army's highest-ranking officer, and the results of his assessment could determine the future careers of everyone in the command structure. As Samuel Martinez watched news reports about the expanding investigation from his quiet apartment, he felt a growing sense of sadness about the chain of events his simple shopping trip had triggered. 3 young men were facing the destruction of their military careers, an entire base was under lockdown and investigation, and national attention was focused on an incident that he would have preferred to handle quietly and privately. But even as he wished for a different outcome, Samuel understood why the military leadership was responding with such intensity. The respect for veterans that these young soldiers had failed to demonstrate was not just a nice ideal. It was a fundamental principle that held the military community together across generations of service. The 3 soldiers now confined in the base detention facility were beginning to understand the same truth, though their comprehension was coming far too late to change the course of events they had set in motion with their moment of casual cruelty toward an old man they had dismissed as irrelevant. The storm they had unleashed was far from over, and the full consequences of their actions were still to be revealed. General Harrison's arrival at Fort Henderson was marked by a level of ceremony and security that the base had rarely witnessed. The Army Chief of Staff traveled with an entourage that included his personal aide, the Secretary of the Army's representative, a team of investigators from the Pentagon's Inspector General Office, and a military historian whose presence puzzled everyone until the purpose of his visit became clear. Colonel Patterson stood at attention on the flight line as General Harrison's aircraft touched down, knowing that the next few hours would likely determine not only his own future, but the future of many officers under his command. The general's reputation for thorough, uncompromising assessments of military leadership had preceded him, and Patterson was acutely aware that Fort Henderson was about to undergo the most intensive scrutiny in its history. Harrison's first action upon arriving was unexpected. Rather than beginning with a traditional inspection of base facilities or meetings with senior staff, he requested to be taken immediately to the base detention facility where Jake Morrison, Marcus Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez were being held. His intention was to personally assess the 3 soldiers whose actions had triggered this crisis. The detention facility had been prepared for the general's visit, but nothing could have prepared the 3 soldiers for the reality of being interviewed by the Army's highest-ranking officer. Each soldier was brought to the conference room individually, where General Harrison sat across from them, with only a military stenographer present to record the conversation. Jake Morrison was the first to be questioned. As he was escorted into the room, still wearing his military detention uniform, he found himself face-to-face with a 4-star general whose chest displayed ribbons representing every major military action of the past 3 decades. The weight of Harrison's stare and the significance of his presence immediately made clear to Morrison that this situation had escalated far beyond anything he could have imagined. Private First Class Morrison, Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. I want you to explain to me, in your own words, what happened at the commissary yesterday morning. Morrison's recounting of events was halting and defensive. He attempted to minimize his role in the confrontation, suggesting that it had been primarily Tommy Rodriguez who had escalated the situation to physical contact. He described Samuel Martinez as just an old guy who had been moving too slowly and blocking their path. General Harrison listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave as Morrison revealed his complete lack of understanding about what he had done and who he had done it to. When Morrison finished his account, Harrison leaned forward slightly and asked a question that would haunt the young soldier for years to come. Private Morrison, do you know who Colonel Samuel Martinez is? The question clearly confused Morrison, who replied that he had no idea the elderly man was a colonel or that he was anyone of particular importance. This response prompted Harrison to open a thick folder that contained documentation that would fundamentally alter Morrison's understanding of the incident. Colonel Martinez, Harrison began, is not just any retired colonel. He is one of the most decorated and respected veterans in modern American military history. His service record spans 5 decades and includes every major military action from Vietnam to Iraq. He has been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 5 Bronze Stars, 3 Silver Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts. As Harrison continued reading from Martinez's service record,
Morrison's face grew increasingly pale.
The list of commendations, leadership positions, and combat actions painted a picture of a soldier whose contributions to American military success were legendary within professional military circles. Furthermore, Harrison continued, Colonel Martinez personally mentored or served alongside most of the current senior military leadership, including myself. He shaped the careers and thinking of the generals who now lead the Army, the Marines, and significant portions of the Air Force and Navy. The full impact of this information was clearly visible on Morrison's face as he began to understand that he had not just assaulted any elderly veteran, but had physically attacked a figure who commanded personal respect and admiration from the highest levels of military leadership. Harrison then revealed information that completed Morrison's understanding of the catastrophic nature of his actions. Colonel Martinez called me personally to discuss this incident, not to complain about his treatment, and not to demand punishment for you and your colleagues, but to express his concern about the attitudes toward veterans that your behavior represented. The revelation that Samuel Martinez had actually tried to minimize the incident rather than seeking revenge or punishment seemed to impact Morrison more than any of the previous information. For the first time during the interview, Morrison appeared to grasp the moral dimension of what he had done, beyond just the military disciplinary consequences he was facing. Similar interviews with Marcus Chen and Tommy Rodriguez produced comparable revelations and reactions. Each soldier was forced to confront not just the immediate consequences of their actions, but the broader implications of their attitudes toward military service and veteran respect. Rodriguez, who had delivered the physical push that escalated the incident to assault, was particularly affected by learning about Martinez's combat record and physical sacrifices. When Harrison described the injuries Martinez had sustained during his multiple combat deployments, including the knee problems that necessitated his use of a cane, Rodriguez broke down completely. Sir, Rodriguez said through tears, I didn't know. We just thought he was some old guy who was taking too long. We didn't know he was a war hero. Harrison's response was swift and unforgiving. Private Rodriguez, the problem is not that you didn't know Colonel Martinez was a war hero.
The problem is that you thought it was acceptable to assault any elderly veteran, regardless of their service record or current status. Your ignorance of his specific accomplishments does not excuse your fundamental failure to respect military service and veteran status. After completing his interviews with the three soldiers, Harrison moved to the next phase of his investigation, a comprehensive review of the leadership failures that had allowed such attitudes to develop and persist within Fort Henderson's command structure. The investigation revealed systemic problems that extended far beyond the three soldiers who had been arrested. Their immediate supervisors had received multiple complaints about disrespectful behavior toward veterans and retirees but had failed to address these issues with appropriate seriousness. Company commanders had been aware of attitude problems but had treated them as minor disciplinary matters rather than fundamental character flaws that required intensive correction.
Most damaging to the base's leadership was the discovery that several senior non-commissioned officers had actually encouraged or tolerated negative attitudes toward retirees and veterans, viewing them as burdensome reminders of outdated military traditions rather than honored figures deserving of respect and consideration. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the senior NCO responsible for supervising the three arrested soldiers, was found to have made multiple disparaging comments about old-timers who needed to get out of the way and let the new military handle things. His attitudes had clearly influenced the soldiers under his supervision and had contributed to the atmosphere that made the commissary incident possible. The investigation also revealed that formal complaints about disrespectful behavior toward veterans had been filed with the base command but had not been properly investigated or addressed. Base personnel had developed a culture of dismissing such complaints as inevitable friction between different generations of military personnel rather than serious breaches of military values that required immediate correction. As General Harrison's investigation continued, he made a decision that would send shockwaves throughout the military community. He announced that he would be personally visiting Samuel Martinez to apologize on behalf of the United States Army and to request his assistance in addressing the broader issues that the Fort Henderson incident had revealed. The visit to Samuel Martinez's apartment was unprecedented in recent military history. Army chiefs of staff simply did not make personal visits to retirees in their homes, regardless of their service records or personal relationships with current leadership. Harrison's decision to visit Martinez personally elevated the incident beyond a simple disciplinary matter into a defining moment for military values and veteran respect. Samuel Martinez received advance notice of Harrison's visit, but he remained uncomfortable with the attention and ceremony that was being directed toward him. In his mind, he had simply been the victim of poor behavior by young soldiers who needed correction and education, not punishment and career destruction. When General Harrison arrived at Martinez's modest apartment, accompanied only by his aide and a security detail,
The contrast between the simple surroundings and the magnitude of the official response was striking. Martinez, dressed in casual civilian clothes and moving slowly with his cane, welcomed the Army's highest-ranking officer into his living room, with the same quiet dignity he had displayed during the commissary incident.
"Sam," Harrison said, using the informal address that reflected their personal relationship dating back 20 years, "I came here personally because what happened to you represents a failure by the Army that goes far beyond the actions of 3 individual soldiers." Martinez invited Harrison to sit down and offered coffee, treating the visit as he would any social call rather than an official military function. This normalcy seemed to emphasize the absurdity of the situation. One of the most powerful figures in the American military was sitting in a retiree's living room, apologizing for the failure of soldiers under his ultimate command to show proper respect to a veteran.
"General," Martinez replied, "I appreciate your concern, but I hope this situation can be resolved without destroying the futures of 3 young men who made a serious mistake."
Harrison's response revealed the broader implications of the incident that extended far beyond the immediate participants. "Sam, this isn't just about 3 soldiers anymore. The investigation has revealed systematic failures in leadership, training, and military culture that require comprehensive correction. Your assault was the symptom of much larger problems that threaten the fundamental values that hold our military together." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Harrison explaining the scope of the investigation and the changes that would be implemented not just at Fort Henderson but throughout the military system. The incident had become a catalyst for examining veteran relations, leadership training, and military culture across all branches of service. During their discussion, Harrison revealed information about the investigation that had not been made public. The 3 soldiers involved were facing court-martial proceedings that could result in dishonorable discharge, military prison time, and permanent criminal records. Their immediate supervisors were being relieved of duty and faced administrative separation from the military. Senior officers at Fort Henderson, including Colonel Patterson, were being reassigned pending further investigation into their leadership failures. The scope of consequences stemming from what had begun as a brief confrontation at a commissary was staggering. Careers spanning decades were ending, military units were being reorganized, and policies affecting the entire military were being revised, all because 3 soldiers had decided to humiliate and physically assault an elderly veteran they had dismissed as irrelevant. As General Harrison prepared to leave Martinez's apartment, he made a request that would further elevate the significance of the incident. "Sam, I want to ask you to consider accepting a position as Special Advisor on Veteran Affairs and Military Culture. The Army needs your voice and your perspective as we work to address the issues that your experience has brought to light." The offer represented an opportunity for Martinez to transform his negative experience into positive change for future generations of military personnel. It also indicated the level of respect and trust that current military leadership continued to place in his judgment and expertise. As Harrison's official vehicle departed from Martinez's quiet neighborhood, the full scope of the transformation that had been triggered by the commissary incident was becoming clear. What had begun as a moment of casual cruelty toward an elderly veteran had evolved into a comprehensive examination of military values, leadership standards, and the respect owed to those who had served their country with distinction. The 3 soldiers who had started this chain of events remained in military custody, beginning to understand that their moment of poor judgment had created consequences far beyond anything they could have imagined. Their actions had not just affected their own futures, they had triggered changes that would impact the entire military for years to come. The court-martial proceedings for Jake Morrison, Marcus Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez began 6 weeks after their arrest, in a military courtroom at Fort Henderson that had been specially configured to accommodate the unprecedented level of attention the case had generated. Military legal observers, journalists covering veteran affairs, and representatives from veteran organizations filled every available seat, recognizing that this trial would establish important precedents for how the military addressed disrespect toward veterans. Colonel Patricia Hernandez, serving as the military judge, opened the proceedings with remarks that established the broader significance of the case beyond the immediate charges against the 3 defendants. This court-martial addresses not just the specific actions of these 3 soldiers, but fundamental questions about military values, respect for service, and the standards of conduct expected from all personnel who wear the uniform of the United States military. The prosecution, led by Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, presented evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of the defendants' actions and attitudes. Security camera footage from the commissary showed the entire incident, from the initial verbal harassment through the physical assault that had sent Samuel Martinez stumbling backward. Audio recordings captured the cruel laughter and dismissive comments that had accompanied their treatment of the elderly veteran. More damaging than the evidence of the specific incident, however,
was testimony from numerous witnesses about the defendant's pattern of disrespectful behavior toward veterans and retirees. Soldiers, civilian employees, and base personnel recounted months of incidents where the three had displayed attitudes that were fundamentally incompatible with military values of honor, respect, and appreciation for service. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, the military police officer who had witnessed the commissary incident, provided testimony that established not just the facts of what had occurred, but the broader context of why it was so significant. As I watched these three soldiers humiliating and then physically assaulting Colonel Martinez, I realized I was witnessing something that went far beyond a simple confrontation. I was watching the complete breakdown of military discipline and respect for veterans. When Samuel Martinez took the stand as a prosecution witness, the courtroom fell completely silent. Walking slowly to the witness chair with his cane, he embodied the dignity and service that the defendants had failed to recognize and respect. His testimony was brief and factual, describing the events at the commissary without embellishment or emotional appeals for sympathy. "I was simply trying to go shopping," Martinez said in response to the prosecutor's questions. The three defendants began making disparaging comments about my age and my pace. They assumed I was some kind of burden or inconvenience, and they made it clear that they felt I had no business taking up their time or space. More powerful than his description of the incident, however, was Martinez's response when asked about the impact of the defendant's actions. The physical push was painful but not seriously injurious. What was far more disturbing was the attitude these young soldiers displayed toward military service and veteran status. Their behavior suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to wear the uniform and serve the country. The defense attorneys faced an almost impossible challenge in representing their clients. Captain Jennifer Walsh, representing Jake Morrison, attempted to argue that her client's actions were the result of poor judgment and inadequate leadership rather than malicious intent. She emphasized his youth, his previously clean disciplinary record, and his expressed remorse for his actions. Private First Class Morrison made a terrible mistake, Walsh argued during her opening statement. He failed to show proper respect to a distinguished veteran, and he participated in conduct that was completely unacceptable. However, his actions were those of a young soldier who had not been properly educated about military values and veteran respect, not those of someone with malicious intent toward veterans or military service. The defense strategy was complicated by the defendant's own testimony, which revealed continued struggles to understand the seriousness of their actions beyond the immediate legal consequences they faced. When Jake Morrison took the stand in his own defense, his responses to questioning demonstrated a focus on avoiding punishment rather than genuine understanding of what he had done wrong. "I know we shouldn't have said those things or pushed him," Morrison testified. "I just wish we had known he was a colonel. If we had known how important he was, we never would have acted that way." This statement prompted immediate objection from the prosecution and follow-up questioning from the military judge that revealed the depth of Morrison's continued misunderstanding. Colonel Hernandez asked directly, "Private Morrison, are you saying that your conduct would have been acceptable if Colonel Martinez had been a less distinguished veteran?" Morrison's confused response demonstrated that he still failed to grasp the fundamental principle that all veterans deserved respect regardless of their rank or accomplishments. This exchange became a defining moment of the trial, illustrating why the military leadership had responded to the incident with such intensity and comprehensive action. Similar testimony from Marcus Chen and Tommy Rodriguez revealed comparable failures to understand military values beyond their immediate application to their own legal situations. Their focus remained primarily on minimizing their punishment rather than demonstrating genuine comprehension of why their actions had been so fundamentally wrong. The sentencing phase of the trial brought testimony from character witnesses that provided additional context for understanding both the defendant's failures and the military's response to those failures. Senior officers who had served with Samuel Martinez throughout his career testified about his character, his contributions to military success. General Morrison, appearing as a character witness for Martinez, provided testimony that helped the court understand why the assault had generated such unprecedented response from military leadership. "Colonel Martinez shaped my understanding of military service, leadership, and the values that make our military effective. His influence on my career and my approach to leadership cannot be overstated. When I learned that soldiers under my ultimate command had physically assaulted this man, it represented not just a criminal act, but a fundamental failure of the military system I have dedicated my life to serving." The testimony phase concluded with an unexpected development. Samuel Martinez requested permission to address the court regarding sentencing recommendations for the three defendants. His statement would become one of the most widely quoted examples of military leadership and veteran dignity in modern military history. "Your Honor," Martinez began, his voice steady despite his obvious physical discomfort from sitting in the courtroom for extended periods,
I want to address the court about these three young men and the consequences they should face for their actions. Martinez paused briefly before continuing with words that would surprise everyone in the courtroom, including the defendants.
While their actions were completely unacceptable and demonstrated serious failures in character and military understanding, I do not believe that destroying their futures serves the best interests of military justice or military education. The statement prompted visible surprise from the prosecution team and relief from the defense attorneys. But Martinez was not finished with his remarks.
However, I also believe that simple punishment without education and intensive correction would represent a missed opportunity to address the broader problems that made their behavior possible. Martinez then proposed an alternative to traditional military punishment that would become known as the Martinez Protocol and would be adopted throughout the military for addressing similar incidents.
Rather than immediate discharge or extensive military prison time, he recommended that the three soldiers be sentenced to intensive education about military history, veteran affairs, and the broader meaning of military service, combined with extensive community service within veteran organizations.
These young men need to understand not just that what they did was wrong, but why it was wrong and how their actions affected not just me personally, but the broader military community. Martinez explained, traditional punishment might deter similar behavior, but education and direct service to veterans might actually transform their understanding and create positive change. The court-martial panel deliberated for 2 days before announcing sentences that incorporated Martinez's recommendations while also ensuring that serious consequences followed the defendant's actions.
Jake Morrison, as the leader of the group, was sentenced to reduction in rank to Private E1, forfeiture of pay for 6 months, and 12 months of intensive community service with veteran organizations, combined with mandatory education courses about military history and veteran affairs. Marcus Chen and Tommy Rodriguez received similar sentences with variations based on their specific roles in the incident.
All three were required to complete extensive programs designed to educate them about military values and veteran respect, and all three would remain under intensive supervision for the remainder of their military service. More significantly, all three were required to make formal apologies to Samuel Martinez and to speak to military units throughout their region about their experience and the lessons they had learned from their actions.
This requirement ensured that their negative experience would become a source of positive education for other military personnel.
The broader consequences of the Fort Henderson incident extended far beyond the individual punishments imposed on the three soldiers. Colonel Patterson and several other senior officers were relieved of command and reassigned to positions where they could undergo additional leadership training focused on military values and veteran relations.
The investigation had revealed systemic problems in military education about veteran affairs and respect for service that required comprehensive correction throughout all branches of military service. New training programs were implemented that specifically addressed interaction with veterans, understanding of military history, and the continuing obligations that active duty personnel had toward those who had served before them. Fort Henderson itself underwent a complete transformation in its approach to veteran relations and military culture. The base established a new position, Director of Veteran Affairs and Military Heritage, whose role was to ensure that all base personnel understood and demonstrated appropriate respect for veterans and military traditions. Perhaps most significantly, Samuel Martinez accepted General Harrison's offer to serve as a special advisor on veteran affairs and military culture. In this role, he worked with military leadership to develop comprehensive programs that would prevent future incidents like the one he had experienced.
Martinez's new position involved traveling to military bases throughout the country, speaking to soldiers about military service, veteran respect, and the continuity of values that connected past and present generations of military personnel. His presentations became legendary within military circles not just for their content but for the dignity and wisdom he brought to discussions about service and sacrifice.
6 months after the court-martial concluded, an unexpected development provided a powerful conclusion to the story. Jake Morrison, Marcus Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez, having completed intensive education about military history and veteran affairs, requested permission to meet privately with Samuel Martinez to express their genuine remorse and understanding of what they had done.
The meeting took place at Martinez's apartment, the same location where General Harrison had come to apologize on behalf of the Army. The three young soldiers, now genuinely educated about Martinez's service record and the broader meaning of military service, offered apologies that demonstrated real understanding, rather than simply regret about consequences.
Colonel Martinez, Jake Morrison said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier behavior, I understand now that what we did wasn't just disrespectful to you personally, but to every veteran and to the military itself. I want to spend the rest of my military service working to honor the sacrifice and service of veterans like yourself.
Martinez accepted their apologies with the same grace he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, but he also used the opportunity to challenge them to become positive influences within the military community.
Your actions created serious harm, he told them, but they also created an opportunity for positive change.
The question now is whether you will use your experience to help other young soldiers understand what you failed to understand. All 3 soldiers accepted this challenge, and their subsequent military service became characterized by active promotion of veteran respect and military values.
Their transformation from perpetrators of veteran disrespect to advocates for veteran affairs became a powerful example of the possibility for positive change even after serious failures in character and judgment.
The Fort Henderson incident ultimately became a case study in military justice, veteran affairs, and the power of dignity in the face of disrespect. Samuel Martinez's response to assault and humiliation demonstrated the values that had made him a respected leader throughout his military career, while the military's comprehensive response showed that disrespect toward veterans would not be tolerated under any circumstances.
Years later, the incident would be taught at military academies as an example of how individual actions can have far-reaching consequences, and how proper leadership can transform negative events into opportunities for positive change. The Martinez Protocol became standard practice throughout the military for addressing incidents involving disrespect toward veterans, emphasizing education and understanding rather than simple punishment.
Samuel Martinez continued his service as special advisor until his death 8 years later, at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by military leadership from all branches of service, including the 3 generals whose immediate response to his assault had triggered the comprehensive changes in military culture and veteran relations.
Among the honor guard at his funeral were 3 soldiers whose presence might have surprised those unfamiliar with the full story. Jake Morrison, Marcus Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez, who had requested and received permission to serve as part of the ceremony honoring the veteran they had once assaulted but had learned to respect and admire. Their participation in Martinez's funeral represented the completion of a transformation that had begun with their moment of cruelty and evolved through education, understanding, and genuine commitment to the values they had once failed to recognize.
It was a fitting conclusion to a story that demonstrated both the consequences of disrespecting service and the possibility of redemption through genuine change and commitment to higher values. They struck an old veteran. Minutes later, 3 generals locked the base.